Hi there. So I wanted to put together this video so that we can provide really all of our clients, but anybody who's looking at our online content and taking into account any of the advice that we give on our social media platforms, or doing private sessions, group classes, whatever with us. We really wanted to make a base video to just provide some of the core basic learning theory principles that we use when making decisions about how to direct clients to meet their behavior goals. So for us, our ultimate goal in training and working with clients and doing the business that we do is to empower owners to really autonomously decide how they want to proceed with the training with their dogs. So rather than having to come to us for every little thing that might pop up, we want to kind of provide that core learning that allows our clients to independently make decisions and know how to troubleshoot so that they're not coming back and asking questions for every little thing. So we want everybody who's in our programs to understand really the basic theory behind our training philosophy so that they, even though we love them and we want them to work with us and come and do training with us and get feedback from us, we really want them to not need us, because to us that's true success for our clients and their dogs, is where they're able to troubleshoot all of kind of the little pieces that go along and feel confident enough in their own knowledge and abilities to start making really important choices for their dogs, because an hour a week here and there with us is such a small amount of your life. So really, in order to do that, you need to have a really good understanding of how the dog works, and how your behavior and your decisions influence your dog. So the first thing that we like to go over with clients when we're kind of doing a deeper dive is some definitions. So like any other high school class, college course you may have taken, really, dog training is founded in a lot of psychology and science. So we do have some really basic wordplay that we need to define before we can put a name to the things that we're doing and why. So training would fall under an umbrella of what we would call conditioning. So basically, all that means is we're creating a response in the animal from something that was previously neutral. So you're going to hear me talk a lot about stimuli and creating a response. So training is really just a form of intentional conditioning. So rather than say, a dog may learn not to touch an electric fence if you take them to a farm because the fence itself previously had no meaning. They touched it, went, holy crap, that felt, not great, and decided that they, in the future, would avoid that fence. That's kind of their environment conditioning them and their decisions conditioning them. So all we're doing in training is really intentionally showing the dog a series of events to change the way they respond to certain stimuli, and doing that intentionally so that we can control outcomes and really create the behaviors that we want, for the less sciencey, just taking your dog out and enjoying them and having a dog that is predictable and you can read their behavior in a way that you can have a pretty good idea of what they're going to do before they actually do it. So diving into conditioning, we are going to look at a core 2 categories of conditioning, and I'm really going to dive into each of them separately. So these are just kind of 2 umbrella ways to categorize conditioning and dog behavior. They're not so much rules as just a way of looking at how the dog works. So the first is what we would call operant conditioning, and the other is classical conditioning. And to separate the 2 of those, I typically will talk about operant conditioning as conditioning of voluntary responses. So the dog is making choices based on conditioning that has happened. And classical conditioning would cover things that are involuntary, and we'll dive into that. But these 2 types of conditioning, I think a lot of people tend to look at them as like totally separate things and they have to be done separately. And, maybe you are an operant conditioning trainer or a classical conditioning trainer. And in reality, it's really kind of a gray area, interconnected way of looking at training. So your operant conditioning may impact your classical conditioning and vice versa. So we'll dive in there a little bit, but it's simple in theory when we're breaking it down into pieces so that it's easily digestible for us, but in the real world, these things are not mutually exclusive. They are working together often. So we'll start with operant conditioning because that's really what a lot of dog trainers are talking about when they're introducing ways to start influencing behavior in your dog. It's, a lot of what you're looking at when you take a basic obedience class is, really focused on operant work and influencing a dog making decisions. And so if you dive into any sort of online discussion of methods or dog training or, really getting into the weeds, you'll often see a lot of people referencing a lot of the terminology that falls under operant conditioning. So, getting started. Operant conditioning was first outlined by a guy named Skinner, using rats for experiments. And basically, what he does in his operant conditioning model is outline the ways that an animal's behavior can be made more or less frequent through the addition or subtraction of reinforcement or punishment. So the terminology underneath operant conditioning is where a lot of people get tripped up. So this is turns into kind of the Wild West if you're online and looking at kind of discussions over people who would say they are positive only or punishment-based trainers. And there's a lot of terminology that gets thrown around that is not really accurate to the scientific version. So my goal here is to really kind of clear that up, make that more scientific and less emotive. So as we dive into what all of these terms mean, I want to begin by saying that all of these terms are coming from a purely scientific base rather than anything that's kind of good, bad, and generally like emotive. And that's where a lot of people run into trouble because some of these terms are often connected to like morality to us, but when we're speaking about them in this context, it's very much just the facts. So diving in, we're going to be talking about all of these pieces in what's called the quadrants of operant conditioning. So I'm not sure how easy that is to see, but I'm going to kind of talk about all of the verbiage on here before diving into what this whole grid means. But first off, we're going to be talking about things in terms of positive and negative. So this is where I think that emotion becomes a little bit tricky because a lot of people think, ooh, positive's good, negative's bad. That's not what it means in this context. So really all we're looking at when we say positive in this is to add something to the equation. And when we're saying negative, we're subtracting it, taking it away from the equation. We're also going to be talking about reinforcement, which is just something that makes a behavior more likely to happen or more frequent. Punishment, on the other hand, another one that tends to have a little bit more emotion attached just from other contexts in humanity, just means to make a behavior less likely or less frequent. So it doesn't necessarily need to be something that's painful or super aversive. It's just something that makes an animal less likely to do that thing. So we'll dive in a little bit more and kind of break down what these are. So these are called our quadrants. And it's basically just a way to categorize how an organism responds to stimuli and their environment. So the one that everybody has probably heard about in terms of dog training is what's called positive reinforcement. So positive reinforcement is adding something to make a behavior more frequent or more likely. So really easy version of this is you ask your dog to sit and then you give them a treat. The word sit previously meant nothing to the dog. Now they're learning that sit and then them continuing that action of sitting unlocks this thing that they want, this reward. So that's your reinforcement. On the flip side, we have something called negative reinforcement. So you're removing something to make a behavior more frequent. Now this one right here is the quadrant that I think is most frequently misunderstood or misrepresented. A lot of people think of negative reinforcement as something uncomfortable or bad, and that's not necessarily the case. So in my opinion, this is a super valuable category of training that can really assist a lot of owners in finding a lot of success and helping their dogs find clarity without making it very stressful. So this is an area in training that we implement a lot and will be really important for our clients to understand as we move forward in practical application. So a really easy example of negative reinforcement that I like to borrow from another trainer who I've listened to pretty extensively, is the sound that your car makes when you get in. You put your keys in, but you haven't put your seatbelt on. So if you pop in, turn your car on, you know, anybody who has a car knows that their car is going to beep, beep, beep at you. Not painful, not super aversive, but a little annoying. And it's just a reminder. And most people start to put their seatbelt on as soon as they hear that. As soon as your seatbelt is clicked, it turns off. So it's just taking something that was very minorly annoying, and you're able to turn that off through your behavior, through buckling that seatbelt. And eventually you'll start to do it without necessarily even thinking about it. Your brain kind of hears the beep, you're already moving before you even have made any sort of conscious decision. All right, so moving on. The next quadrant over here is what we would call positive punishment. So that would be adding something in to make a behavior less likely. So a really easy example of that would be a dog with an electric fence. So if you have a dog out on an invisible fence, they start to learn that if they go to move outside of that boundary line, they'll be hit with a pretty high level of stimulation from their fence collar. And so basically, you make the behavior of leaving the boundary line less frequent or non-existent through the addition of that stimulation. Pretty straightforward, pretty easy. The other one that tends to be a little bit misunderstood is that negative punishment. And this one I find gets overlooked often as well, because it is a kind of conceptually different category than your real straightforward positive reinforcement, positive punishment. So your negative punishment, you're taking something out of the equation to make a behavior less likely. For me, a really good example of this is when I was a kid, say I am in an argument with my mom, I'm being really annoying, or I'm asking to do something she doesn't want me to do, and I just keep pushing. And she'll say, okay, if you continue with this argument and you don't listen to what I'm telling you, then you are not going to be allowed to go to your horseback riding lesson this week. That was a really effective one for me. So taking something away that I wanted, so that riding lesson, as a way to make my arguing less likely. So again, there's a lot of really finite versions of this, or small versions of this, that happen, especially with dogs. So an easy one with dogs is you have a dog chewing a shoe, take the shoe away. So they want that shoe, you remove it in order to make that chewing a shoe less likely. So, fairly straightforward to start looking at all of these quadrants and making sense of what they mean. Looking at them in practicality can get kind of complicated. There's some things that, might seem like negative reinforcement, but are actually positive punishment. Things that might look like positive punishment to the average outsider, but really what's happening is the dog is turning off pressure and learning to create a behavior that way. So even though it looks real simple on paper, we can get pretty deep in the weeds in discussion. But this is really important to me when starting to make decisions about, okay, what do I want to influence in my dog? So starting to really look at, is the behavior I'm observing in my dog something that I want to see more of or less of? And if so, should I be looking at reinforcement or should I be looking at punishment? And there's, ways to tweak things where you can say, hey, I have this behavior that I don't like and I'd like to see less of, but maybe I can replace it with another behavior. So that may fall under more reinforcement techniques. But I find it really important for owners to have this so that you can start experimenting with, okay, I know I want to fix this. What can I strategize to do with my dog in order to adjust my situation? Whether it's to have my dog lay down and stay in a down if we go out to a restaurant, or if I want my dog to stop pulling on a leash. So this kind of thought process, I think, is very important for owners. Instead of just looking at a problem like, oh, this is happening, what do I do to respond to it? Start thinking about it in a bigger sense of what behaviors am I being presented with? How do I want to influence them? And what creative solutions can I come up with in order to change how that is going? Another big topic I wanted to talk about with this that I didn't really cover as well is that these are kind of fluid concepts depending on the animal you're talking about and depending on the specific individual. So like reinforcement, something that makes a behavior more likely, positive reinforcement in particular, so adding something there, it will look different depending on what that dog finds reinforcing. So, a really great example of the differences that can occur there is something like water. So if you have a dog who is traditionally like a retrieving breed, so something like a Labrador, you typically will find that those dogs are obsessed with water. And that is something that they find very reinforcing. They love swimming, the access to water, playing fetch in the water, whatever it is. My personal dog, my older dog, she hates water. Water would be extremely punishing for her. So when we're looking at these, there's not a lot of hardcore across the board, this is punishing for every dog and this is reinforcing for every dog. We need to really look at the individual. And even before we start deciding, all right, we need to add positive reinforcement, we need to start doing some negative punishment, we need to start looking, okay, what does this dog find rewarding? What does this dog find punishing? And is it sufficient to change behavior? So I know we're diving really deep into the weeds here, but this is something that as you work your way through some of our programs, you're going to hear us talk about a lot and start to really demonstrate in our training. So this is really just so you can have a base understanding of what it is we're talking about before we dive into here it is in practice in the real world. And again, this is important just for you to start strategizing on your own without us. All right, and then moving on, things get real wild when we start factoring in our other form of conditioning as well, classical conditioning, because this is where we start to see things mesh together a little bit and interrelate. So operant conditioning can make training feel really simple, believe it or not, because it seems like everything's blocked out into nice, neat little categories. If my dog's doing this, I'll just make it less likely through this form of conditioning and vice versa. But when we start factoring in classical conditioning as well, things can get a little more complicated. So classical conditioning was first outlined and made famous by Pavlov. So a lot of people, even if you haven't done a lot of dog training or worked in dog behavior, you may be familiar with Pavlov's experiments. His most famous study demonstrated the use of a previously meaningless stimulus, a bell, with dogs to create an involuntary response in the dog, so salivating, by giving them food after hearing the bell. So it would be ring a bell, follow with the food, ring a bell, follow with the food, and eventually when they'd ring the bell, the dog would start salivating even when the food was not present. There's a lot we can dive into with that study, and I won't go into that today, but very basically what he's showing is that the environment, and specifically like in our context, us as owners and dog handlers, we are able to manipulate the responses of our dog in their involuntary behaviors or involuntary processes. So even though the dog is not making a conscious decision to salivate there, the conditioning that we have done has created that response in the dog. So this is something that we don't talk about as specifically when we're creating major plans in the way that we will reference operant conditioning, but it becomes really important when we're looking at things like emotion in our dogs and just general brain chemistry. So those are things that do tend to be less voluntary to your dog, but that doesn't mean we can't influence that in some way. So it's not quite as simple as, oh, hey, my dog wants the ball, so what can I teach him to do to get the ball? It's more changing the way a dog may feel about a certain situation. So, trying to address things like fear, this becomes really important. And in relation more to like reward work in our operant conditioning, often we're conditioning the dog to experience a big surge in positive hormones in the dog. So things like dopamine and pleasure. And start to create that in a way that the dog isn't consciously deciding to be happy because there's treats there. We've conditioned the dog to equate a behavior with the food. All right, so I'm going to try and keep this a little bit as simple as I can. But so what we're really looking at mostly is hormones in the dog. So there's a lot that we could go into as far as involuntary responses, but what we're really going to focus on for the sake of this video and mostly for the sake of dog behavior is stress responses and dopamine responses, basically. So your hormone responses. So the stress response would be something like the dog perceives a threat, produces a hormonal response, which kind of triggers their fight, flight, freeze, or friend responding there. And, they may come into contact with the first thing that triggers that response. And it maybe doesn't create the association really quickly there where it's concrete, like, ooh, every time I see this thing, I get this flood of fear. But if this is repeated many, many times, then we may start to see those hormones released earlier and earlier, completely out of the control of the dog. So we'll see this a lot in reactivity cases and aggression cases if they're fear-based, or just general anxiety-based, where the dog kind of almost conditions themselves to really like amping up in certain chemicals like adrenaline, just at the site of whatever that trigger or stimulus is. So if you're somebody who's taking a reactivity course with us, this is the piece that's going to become very important for you, because it influences how much control the dog has in the decisions they're making. So if their classical conditioning has reached a point where they experience extreme fluctuations in some of these stress hormones at the site of certain triggers, they're going to have a limited ability to make those voluntary decisions that we see in the operant conditioning side. So, we really are going to want to be conscious of what conditioning may be happening outside of our intentional conditioning with the dog, and also find ways to influence that. So there's something that's called counter conditioning, and often counter conditioning is really employing classical conditioning models. So counter conditioning is basically taking an animal that has a previously created response. So say I use that example of a dog that maybe is fearful of other dogs. They see that other dog, that trigger, they get this flood of adrenaline, they get, really hectic, their behavior starts to change. You can just kind of see that they're not processing things in really a logical way. They're kind of hitting their lizard brain where they're just acting on impulse. And basically, what we can start to do through counter conditioning is attempt to change the way the dog feels about those triggers and change that response over so that instead of getting that flood of adrenaline, they're maybe getting a flood of cortisol. So a really oversimplified version of this that maybe would work for a lowercase dog or a dog that's highly food motivated is starting to, instead of pairing that trigger or stimulus of another dog with fearfulness and that reacting and barking or whatever it is, and starting to reward the dog following that visual cue. So basically taking something that had a negative meaning to the dog and starting to change it over to something that's a more good or positive version. So this is where that terminology gets hairy, because now I am using negative and positive to mean good and bad, whereas in operant conditioning I wasn't. So this is where terminology matters, but it is challenging even as you get further into your dog training journey. So if that makes sense though, we're looking at starting to take classical conditioning into our own hands and use that to our advantage to do some damage control and change the way that our dog has maybe been previously conditioned, and condition them in a way that we find more agreeable to our lifestyle, and in order to help our dogs experience less anxiety and stress when navigating the real world. So basically creating that really healthy interaction with their environment. Kind of on a flip side to that, we can also talk a lot about classical conditioning when we're talking about operant conditioning. So even when we're just working with a dog and building voluntary behaviors, we want to build some good feeling around those behaviors. So that's why we'll often use things like food and toys as reinforcement in there, because it creates a hormone response of dopamine. And really creates a really happy mindset in the dog to want to engage in the training work that we've presented. So, classical conditioning isn't just working a dog in stress hormones. It can also be in pleasure hormones too. And, I'm very much not deeply educated on neuroscience, but, I'm sure there's thousands of ways that this plays out in an animal's day-to-day body and life. But for the sake of dog training, we're looking most often at changing the way the dog feels about training, the way the dog feels about the things they're commonly seeing in their environment, whether it's other people, guests at your house, your family members, going out for walks, handling car rides, things like that. So I know that this was a really dense chat on basic learning theory in really any animals, but for our conversation dogs. But as we go and we get into more of the practical side, this stuff becomes more and more important. It isn't necessarily a set of rules to live by in your training, but it can help guide you in making decisions in your dog, so you can set them up fairly and you can set yourself up fairly. So you can start to assess, okay, do I want to make behaviors more likely or less likely? And then starting to look at, okay, well, maybe I've tried adding some of these quadrants of operant conditioning and, using my positive reinforcement or using negative punishment here, but I'm still struggling. You may need to start assessing, okay, well, how much of what I'm seeing in my dog is a voluntary action? Do I need to start looking more at what's happening to them internally and involuntarily before we can really start working on that? Or do I need to focus on some of these more operant things in order to help change my dog's mindset? So really the purpose of this video is not to really set specific guidelines on how to train, but just in creating a bit more of a deep understanding of behavior and what we're looking at as we seek to change behavior in another animal. And basically just change mindset when approaching training. It's not just as simple, if my dog does this, what do I do? Because I think really the most effective training that we see in our clients and in dog owners on the whole is when people start approaching training as more of this matrix of options that you can decide on, and this kind of constantly changing problem, like a big puzzle where you're just starting to take what knowledge and tools you have and start plugging them in, and then watching your dog to see if you get the response that you're looking for that benefits you and your dog. and then moving from there. So rather than this kind of cookie cutter, just, okay, if I have, a reactive dog, or if I have a shy dog, then I'll just, find this one video of this one exercise and hope it works. Because this trainer on YouTube told me that I should do this one thing and it will fix all reactive dogs. Because the reality of it is that it's much more complicated than that. And for us, we want to make sure that our clients aren't feeling like they are not having success because they are doing something wrong, and rather give them this mentality of, if something's not working, how can I empower myself to learn more about my dog and create a creative solution? So moving forward, we will definitely be looking at more practical work with dogs, but we'll often be calling back to these concepts as well. If you want to learn more about any of that stuff, you're always welcome to send me an email message. I'll try my best to get back to everybody. But there's endless amounts of information about operant conditioning and classical conditioning and how that affects animal behavior and training online in books, whatnot. And if you'd like to, chat with me about resources and check in whether, something that you're looking at might be helpful in relation to learning more about your dog, absolutely feel free to reach out. If you're another trainer or someone who's just a behavior enthusiast, I am always open to gaining new information and resources that will either help me or my clients. So please feel free to either comment here or send more information to me directly, so that we can just collectively all keep learning. All right, thanks.